All right. Hi, I'm Richard Thompson, and I'm a member of the All Souls Unitarian Universalist Forum Committee. I'm also clearly the best dressed gentleman here. No, in all seriousness, welcome to the All Souls Forum. It's our mission to provide a platform for the discussion of significant issues, especially those affecting ethical values in our contemporary world, and to promote critical thinking. In the time of COVID-19, we will be meeting online until we can resume in-person services. We recognize the limitations of the Zoom platform. However, we are very confident that we can provide quality Zoom programs. Today, it is my honor and privilege to introduce Dr. Bryce Reeder, Associate Professor of Political Science at Mizzou, who is here to discuss the topic of the Paris Climate Agreement. When Bryce is done here, we're going to take up a short break and then go into a structured and recorded question and answer session. With that, Bryce, please take it away.
All right. Thank you, Richard. And I can confirm that you are indeed the best dressed person here. I don't know if that's okay for me to say, but that's, there you go. That bow tie is amazing. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And as we get going, I first want to thank everybody for coming. I know that on a Sunday there, are other things to do, and I want to thank those that are responsible for reaching out to me. I believe Richard was, just kind of a cold email, and I was happy to get it, because as I was telling the group before we started, is I'm usually either talking to undergraduates, just very like, what do you think, and trying to tease concepts out of them. Or giving research talks, and this is kind of in between, and it's a very pleasant in between that I'm excited to do, and I'm very much looking forward to the Q&A and all of that. But briefly, I want to be clear that I am a political scientist, but I'm not a climate scientist, obviously, and I'm not even someone that traditionally has studied environmental politics. Actually, I got into kind of environmental politics and environmental conflict because I had to, because climate change is accelerating to a pace where it's beginning to kind of bleed into all the work that we do as political scientists. So, for example, in my world, I study why certain countries get involved in civil wars and civil conflicts and how that impacts civilians on the ground, and whether or not the United Nations and other entities can come in and help alleviate that crisis. As I was doing that work, climate came up again and again and again. Right. So, for example, the UN would talk about how there are these various cattle farmers in the Central African Republic. They're part of these two different ethnic groups, and they're going at war with one another simply because of droughts. And there's not enough land for them to graze their livestock anymore. Right. So there's this competition for these scarce resources, and that's making not only civil conflict and other things more common, but also making it much more difficult to actually solve those crises when they do emerge. And then again and again, it just kind of came up, and so climate became something that I think we all are studying more than traditionally we have. A second thing before we get going, my students often joke with me that my classes make their life seem worse, and I apologize if that happens today. The classes are on civil conflict, and they come in and they say, well, the sky is bright and the sun is shining and everything's great. And I leave your class and it's raining and a car almost hits me on my way back to my dorm, and the world seems a little bit darker. And I don't mean that to take place, but I tend to have a more cynical take, and that's not because I think we're doomed or there's significant problems that can't be addressed. It's because I have a habit of pointing out the limitations, hoping that we can improve things and move towards a better future. So that's kind of my approach. But I know that most of you are probably Chiefs fans, so I hope the Chiefs win today, and then you'll probably feel better about yourself. And I'm not even a Chiefs fan. I'm a lifelong Bills fan, because that's how you learn about pain and suffering as a young boy, is kind of how that worked out. So, with that said, let's go ahead and have a conversation. I debated including this, because I know the crowd is not one that needs to necessarily speak to this. There's something. Thanks, Richard, for that. Who on the? Yeah, okay. Fair enough. So I debated even including talking about the science of climate change, because this crowd is not really necessary, obviously, and increasingly And I brought this up before we began, but even students, this isn't really necessary, right? When I first began teaching 5 years ago, I had half the class would be like, well, climate change might be happening, maybe humans are responsible. And now no students are like that, right? Everyone is pretty convinced, they're very concerned, so things have changed. But I think it's worth noting, and many of you may be familiar with this, but the warnings of climate change is not a new thing. It's something that happened long, long ago. And the first warning was in 1899 when T.C. Chamberlain wrote that, hey, these greenhouse gases, right, this greenhouse effect, this may be something that we should consider could impact our planet. And he was actually speaking to many of the prior mass extinction events, which were predicated on changes in the climate, right? So as we begin to kind of reach out and rely upon fossil fuels and develop this technology, this is something we should probably think about, right? So it did this long, long ago, and scientific models began to show this link between humans and climate change in the 1970s, and this link wasn't limited, it was overwhelming evidence, right, long, long ago. And this, of course, gets a little frustrating because we could have acted much earlier, obviously, but that's the politics of this, right? There's very powerful political actors who have an incentive to kind of sow doubt into the debate. But the consensus, which all of you know, obviously, is as strong as any in the scientific community. As I tell my own family, who some are still doubters, I'm from Idaho, which is a very right-leaning state, very strongly so. But the sky is blue, the world's round, and climate change is fundamentally changing our planet, and humans are driving much of that process. Like those are just fundamental facts about the world that we live in today. And as all of you also probably know, public opinion is kind of an outlier in the United States, right? Many other countries and citizens within their countries recognize the role of humans in this process, it being dangerous. In the United States, of course, is a little bit different. It's been politicized, and we could have a whole discussion about why that's the case and the interests at play, and why, for example, my family has a difficult time and talks about the doubts and all that sort of stuff. That's not an accident, right? Powerful interests are powerful, and they can really sway public opinion for a very long time. But the real question that I want to talk about today, and it's not really questions we have to, these definitive answers to, but it's stuff that we can discuss and kind of look at the evidence and where we are, is how bad is it actually going to get? What I found personally is when I would teach this to undergraduates before I had a child, it was very abstract to me, right? But this portion, now that I have a 4-month-old baby, how bad is it going to get? This almost gets emotional to a sense, because the possibilities are such that the world in 2100, when my daughter is apt to actually still be around, is going to be a very, very different world. And it's not going to be a pleasant one unless some huge technological innovation occurs that saves everybody and everything. And of course, that's not something you really want to rely on, right? You should not assume that that's going to happen, even though in the past there is evidence that things like that have happened, right? The Green Revolution, increasing crop yields, able to feed a growing population. We've seen evidence that that's possible, but would not really put all of our hopes in that basket. The second thing, which is the main topic of this presentation, is, well, what's the Paris Agreement going to actually do? And how does this agreement work? What are some limitations? What are some advantages? And how is it working so far? And of course, it's young, right? There's still a lot we don't know about it. So we'll kind of discuss that and make sure that we all kind of have a clear understanding that can guide our conversation moving forward. I won't show many things like this, but what frustrates me about my family, and one of my family stories, which I did not plan on sharing, is as a 12-year-old boy, I learned about climate change and I got upset. I decided that I was going to convince my dad that this was a problem. And so I began approaching him with evidence, trying to convince him, and he's like, okay, whatever. And then I went to school and I printed off a bunch of maps and figures and I brought them home and I'm like, hey, Dad. And eventually he agreed, but I suspect maybe it's because he just wanted me to leave him alone at that point, right? There's a lot of sun bothering you. So I'm not sure if he actually did agree. But you know, at least he became aware, I suppose. And the thing, even at that age, that blew my mind is this left. I hope you can see my cursor, but this left figure here, where we kind of have you know, historical temperatures, and then you have the observed of what's taking place. And even without reading the scientific reports or getting into the nuances of how forecasts are done, this is the eyeball test, right? You see this and the sharp increase, and you say that is outrageous, right? That is just so sharp and so significant and so different that we should be very, very concerned about that, right? So it's that simple, I think. And that's what I tell my students is you don't have to know a lot about how these forecasts and confidence intervals are constructed. And if you're curious, we can talk about that. But what's important is this eyeball test is frightening, and rightfully so, right? Because that's going to lead to a planet that is much different from one that we live in today. This figure on the right is one of my favorites, because essentially what they've done is they said, okay, let's separate the human stuff from the natural stuff, right? So absent human beings, this kind of greenish teal color, this is what we would expect, right? Which is kind of a stable global climate, right? But once you throw, you know, then once you look at the human impact and look at that, then you see the actual difference that we have caused as human beings on this planet, right? And one thing that warrants mention at this point is when I say human beings on this planet, of course, it's not equally distributed across the globe, right? Wealthy, industrialized countries have objectively created the problem for the most part, right? And much of the world, the global south, those are underdeveloped. They're suffering more as a consequence without really being responsible for the ones that produced it in the first place. And this gets to concepts of environmental justice and how they should be protected and those sorts of topics, which I'm not going to get too much into, but we can talk about that later. So the point of this is just, you know, this is astounding data to see, and you can separate the human impact from the natural and see that it is in fact human beings that are driving the process. Even if it wasn't, we would still have to address it anyway, right? Sometimes that political debate can kind of muddy the waters a bit. So this is where my students would start to get sad. And I'm sorry, you're not my students, and I don't want to make you sad. But some unfortunate things you likely already know, but this is going to frame kind of where we're going for the remainder of this talk. A recent survey, and I believe last week this stuff came out, is they asked American citizens aged 16 to 24 if they agree with the statement that humanity is doomed, and 57% said yes. And as we talked about before we actually started, about 9:50-ish or so this morning, this can be a good thing in a sense, right? Because you're scared, you want action, you want change. But yet if you think you're doomed, then how much are you going to act, right? So there's kind of this fine line, but younger people are very concerned, they're very cynical, and they do not really feel good about the world that they live in. And that, of course, I think objectively is very, very tragic, right? And this is happening in the United States, where we are seeing climate change and its impact, obviously, but objectively, we see it less so than other countries who are poor, who can't really prevent themselves from suffering the consequences of climate change. And we haven't polled those young people, but I imagine that this number is even worse in those places. 74% said they were very frightened about the future. And it, you know, it makes me kind of depressed to think about how my daughter might actually respond to these surveys, right? And what she might say here in, I don't know how babies work, but 5 years, I don't know when they, however long that takes. Another noteworthy thing, which, you know, I just like to point out, because sometimes I think we lose context in the larger environments that we live in, right? So just kind of how we do exist within these very specific moments in time, and that these moments sometimes are larger than ourselves and we don't recognize kind of what we're living within. But there's been 5 prior mass extinction events that we know of, and in 4 of those 5, changes in the Earth's climate was the cause, right? So one was the asteroid killed dinosaurs, very famous, mass extinction, yes. But the other 4 were these changes in the Earth's climate, the Earth's environment. And it's important to note that that's 80% of the time that we have seen these events. And we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction event, right? It may span our lifetimes and our kids' lifetimes and their kids' lifetimes. And it takes sometimes a long time to do, but we are losing, we're not only suffering storms and things that impact our own lives and our economies and our well-being, but we're losing, kind of vital animal species and other kind of natural things that are important to us, not only because, for those inherent reasons that they're beautiful and precious and special and all that stuff, but also, of course, it's an ecosystem and it relies upon these things to continue to thrive. So it's important to understand that we are in the midst of this sixth mass extinction event, and that climate change, of course, is a very significant part of that process. The final thing I want to say is, well, not for the presentation, but for this slide, is that climate forecasts are actually been quite accurate. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about what's been predicted, where we are, and I'll show you an example of how accurate that they've actually been. But the fact they have been accurate gives us reason to be concerned, because those forecasts are not very positive, right? Like if there's not fundamental change relatively soon, there will be consequences. And if these forecasts continue to be as reliable as they have been, then we're not in a good place, right? We can end up in a good place, but just important to note. So when we look at the United States, I think objectively, and objectively meaning that it's not really, I'm not interjecting my political beliefs or those things, but you can look out and see that we are seeing devastating events much more frequently. And I think that we can see this in our lives. So, we have more devastating tornadoes. The picture in the upper right is Ida, which of course, hit multiple locations and caused a lot of issues. We have fires in California and out west, and very severe droughts out there as well. And one of my favorite exercises that I do with students is I ask them, what are some changes you've seen in your own communities, in your neighborhoods, right? Like, what has changed in your lifetimes? And they are young kids, right? They're 18 to 22. And even those 18 to 22-year-olds, they've seen changes that are quite noteworthy, right? And I share some of mine as well. I'm from Idaho originally, so out west. When I moved to the Midwest, one thing that I told people that I missed, and it was half a joke, but actually half true, is I missed the smell of a wildfire in the summer. Because every single summer out west, there would be a few fires. You would smell that smell of like the smoke, and it's something that I honestly enjoyed. Now when I go home, there are so many fires that are much more severe that many days it's dangerous to go outside because the air quality is so poor, right? And so in my lifetime, I've seen this acceleration in kind of the intensity of these fires, what they mean to the local community. And it's no longer some, kind of charming little thing about the area I grew up in. It's something that threatens that location. For the first time, my area had to actually get up and be evacuated because the fire was too close. And that's the first time that my parents or myself have known that to happen, right? Another thing is we rely upon snowfall in the winter for our water. Water is scarce in Idaho. There's much less snowfall. So the rivers do not carry it to all the places that need it, and people are suffering as a consequence. And again, maybe this would happen once every 50 years, but now it happens once every 3 years, right? Once every 5 years. And it's so frequent and so common. And so those are the things that I tell them, well, these are the changes that I've seen, right? And they'll come back and tell me, well, I'm from, Philadelphia and I've seen this. I'm from Central Missouri and I've seen this. And they all have these accounts of how the worlds are changing and how that's impacting their lives. And, in the context of acting on climate change, you can see that as a positive because you want to do something, obviously, if you're feeling it, the impacts. But at the same time, it speaks to the fact that it is accelerating. And it's not something which I thought when I was in college, honestly, that I would, that would have to deal with in 50 years, right? It's down the line. Actually, it's something that we're dealing with today in a very active way. Which again, I know I don't have to tell the audience that, but what I want to move to now is this is how we tend to feel it in a relatively wealthy democracy, right? But most of the world are not wealthy democracies. And this is where I kind of do work and what I study, and they feel climate change very differently, right? So if you're not familiar, so the picture in the upper right is Syria, for example. Syria began because there was a historic drought. That historic drought was not only in Syria, but it was in Russia and the entire region. And what happened is the crops were no longer there. They could not feed their population. So Syria looked to Russia and said, Russia, how about you send us some wheat? And Russia said, no, because we had our own drought. We need our wheat so that we can feed our people so they don't get upset, right? So what you had in Syria was a huge escalation in food prices. The Syrian civil war actually began because people were frustrated and threw eggs at government buildings in protesting food prices and the fact they did not have enough to eat because of that historic drought. And that, you could argue, is a climate conflict. Absent climate change, Syria does not look the way it looks today, right? We've had an ongoing genocide in Darfur region in Sudan and Chad, kind of along that border, but mostly in Sudan. And that has been these various groups and communities fighting for land in the context of overwhelming drought, right? And the government coming in and exploiting that situation and exterminating populations using rebellion and other things as a justification. There's an argument that that devastating event would not have occurred absent climate change, right? And this is the theme that we have. And then the upper left is Yemen. Yemen suffers from severe water shortages, right? Those shortages have driven these just fractures in society for a long, long time. We can point to a lot of reasons that war is brewing and outside intervention and the United States providing bombs to Saudi Arabia. He uses them in Yemen and those sorts of things, which are egregious, that should be called out. But without that shortage in water and that scarcity, it would look very different today, objectively, right? So in other places that are less wealthy, less democratic, and where they cannot cope with climate change in the ways that wealthier countries can, climate change looks very different and much more tragic. And as I said before, the tragedy here is that these are people that these countries did not necessarily contribute to the problem, right? It was the wealthier ones that can cope, these ones suffer, and there's that injustice that exists and persists. So just wanted to highlight the difference, how it's bad here objectively, especially. You're impacted by a storm, you lose your home, that is objectively horrifying, but it can get much worse. And, the rest of the world actually experiences a lot of that. So with all that, trying to just, okay, here, look how horrible everything is. I apologize. Let's smile and talk about potential solutions, right? Let's talk about this Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement is relatively complicated, right? There is elements of environmental justice and that sort of stuff. But what I want to point out to you is the three main things that it attempts to do. One is just limit the rise of temperature to 2 degrees or less. Fun fact, that was 1.5 degrees or less, but that climate model assumed that we started reducing emissions in 2020 and reached net zero emissions by 2050. And so come 2021, they're like, well, I don't know if that's possible, right? That's not really working out for us. So let's up the target to 2 instead of 1.5. Already had to make that adjustment. But the big thing here that continues to be part of the agreement is the net zero emissions by mid-century. If that happens, we're in pretty good shape, and I'll show you why here in a second. The second thing is enhanced resilience and the ability to adapt to climate impacts that are certain to occur. The idea here is that we know there's going to be consequences. Those consequences can have further consequences, which we spoke about, right? So domestic unrest, political violence, those sorts of things. So let's make sure we can adapt to those things and kind of predict when they're going to happen and make sure that those impacted populations have support. And of course, all this, given the financial system we operate under, requires money. So we need to work on the flows and make sure that the global financial flows will meet these goals and move in these directions. Because in the end, you can make all the pledges you want, but if the financial kind of market's objectives is still financing coal and oil and those industries, it's just not going to matter, right? It needs to be intertwined, and the flow of resources needs to match what we're trying to accomplish. But for our purposes, I've already gone a lot longer than I wanted to. I'm doing that academic thing. We're like, come talk for 25 minutes. And then the professor's like, I'll talk for 50. And I'm not going to do that. I'm going to move forward. We're going to move on. But I'm going to focus on the 2-degree rise because I want to talk about what 2 degree means and why 2 degrees, right? What's the difference between 2 versus 3 versus 4? And what are we looking at there? So we won't spend too much time here, but this is a very useful figure for a number of different reasons. So the first reason is I told you that I would show you an example of pretty accurate forecasting. So we've already increased by 1 degree Celsius. right? That's something that we've observed. And so what they can do is they can forecast in the upper right here what global warming would do at 1 degree Celsius increase and compare that with what actually happens, right? So what you're looking for is if there is overlap, right, then that means the forecast did pretty good. You can tell that there are some areas where it didn't quite do that well, but again, it's a forecast, it's not perfect, but yet in most locations where forecasted an increase, you saw the increase, which means the forecasts are not perfect, but they are actually pretty good at what they do, which means when you look at these other forecasts at 2 degrees and 4 degrees, you can be quite confident that that's what we will be seeing, right? And so now we can look at what the future might hold, and we'll talk about these in context more in a second, right? So what these colors actually mean and what they might lead us to expect. And at 1.5 degrees, you can almost see an increase in these dry regions out west, right? Which of course we've had droughts out there. You can see the distribution at 2. And then 4 degrees is just a nightmare that I think my brain naturally blocks out because I don't want to look at, right? That's not an environment that you want to live in. And at 4 degrees, it's such that if you live near the equator, there's a chance you can't be outside of your home for more than, 30 minutes without having pretty severe consequences to your body, right? It's just very, very serious circumstances. So, 2, which is the goal, right? Which seems a little odd because it doesn't look great, but at this point, it's not saving us. It's, look, there's going to be changes, there's going to be consequences, and we need to kind of keep it to a level that we can cope with them. Like, that's the goal, right? It's not to reverse it or lead back to where we were. Unfortunately, I wish that were possible. But let's look at these a bit more in context. This is one of my favorite figures, and it might look a little overwhelming at first, but I'll talk you through it. So we talked about events. So for example, these are heat waves, and heat waves kill thousands of people in the United States a year, right? It's something that we see. And we've talked about, for example, there's a 1 in every 10-year event. So if you look at these dots here, there's 10 dots, there's 1 lit up. So given where we were, we can expect 1 of those events every 10 years. It's not great, people suffer, don't want to see it, but that's how often it occurs. And then we have more severe events, 1 in 50-year events, right? And we have what we've already done, which is warmed by 1 degree Celsius. And as you can see, of these 10 dots, we now have 3 of them filled in, which means instead of occurring once every 10 years, these events are occurring 3 out of every 10 years, right? And the frequency is just increasing over time. And this is when it really gets down to the nitty-gritty of what does an increase in temperature actually mean, right? And you can think about the hottest summers or the hottest events you've experienced in Missouri, right? The thing that perhaps you still remember, like, well, that was crazy, right? Perhaps all the crops died, or I don't really know what you saw, but those are the events that we're talking about, and those become much more frequent. 1.5 degrees, if we end up here, we did an amazing job, right? This is really best case scenario, and you're looking 4 out of every 10 years instead of 1. 2 degrees, which is the goal, it's 6 times out of every 10 years, right? So even if at the goals of the Paris Climate Accord, you are looking at a much different future, right? Perhaps you can manage it, perhaps you can cope with it, but it's still a rough place to be. For basically 90% of the time, you're having these sorts of events. Then you can look at the 1 in 50-year events, which are much more severe, and see the growth there. Again, we won't talk through all of them because I know I'm going too long. That's what I promised not to do, but you are too fun to talk to. It's your fault. And I promise I'll finish soon. And you can feel free to cut me off, Richard, by the way, as well. I deserve it. I brought this upon myself. But that said, we can also look at different types of events too, right? One of the worst arguments that climate change isn't a thing is, I forget which congressman brought in a snowball to the Senate and was like, look, it's cold outside and climate change isn't happening. That sort of argument is silly because it's climate change, right? In some places, it's going to get drier. In some places, it's actually going to get wetter. But one anecdote that I shared earlier is my wife's from Ohio. Wetter there means you can't plant your crops. You can't plant your crops. You are in a whole lot of trouble. So here we can look at the same plots, right? The same logic, only the 10-year events, not looking at 50s. And on the left side, we have heavy precipitation, right? So these are those things that can really have consequences. As an aside, in my work on UN peacekeeping, they complain about roads being washed out more than ever, right? We would like to go protect these populations, but the roads keep getting washed out because it rains so much. And again, that's a climate thing that's impacting people. On the right side, we have drought, basically, right? And you can see, given where we are and where we're going, how much more frequent these things are going to become. And of course, every time this stuff happens, you have to rebuild, you have to reestablish, and it's just that process, right? And we're not talking, because we don't have time, about the intensifying storms. We're not talking about the rising sea levels. There's a lot more at play here, right? But this is just kind of a picture of why 2 degrees is not perfect, but it's better than where we might actually end off. All right. All right, so let's talk about this Paris Agreement very, very quickly. Won't talk about the whole thing, but I want to talk about how it's different and how it functions. So the first thing I want to point out, which is good news, you can say, is there's unprecedented participation in the Paris Climate Agreement. The number of countries involved is unlike any other international treaty, which should give you some hope, right? That the world is interested in making some changes. But this is partially because of how it's designed, right? It's designed in a way to promote participation, which is a good thing, right? And I'll talk about that more in a second. If you're familiar, the initial effort during the Clinton years was this Kyoto Protocol, right? Which functioned very differently. And they learned what not to do from this. So the Paris Agreement's bottom up. And what that means is that each country says, here's our goals that we're trying to achieve. Kyoto is different. It said, here's your goals, achieve them or be punished, right? So the approach is giving states the freedom and autonomy to make their own goals, which is why you'll participate, right? Because that's much easier than being forced to do something. In Kyoto, it was only developed countries that were going to act. And one thing that the Clinton administration disliked about Kyoto was that China was considered developing and they didn't have to do anything, even though they were emitting a lot. And so the Clinton administration said, if China is not going to pledge, we're not going to pledge. And it really led to a breakdown of that agreement. But in the Paris Agreement, everyone's responsible for making pledges, right? Every single country needs to pledge a change, needs to try to do something. So that makes it, you could say, more democratic in a sense, right? Everyone's involved. It's voluntary and relies on this concept of nationally determined contributions, which I'll talk more about in a second. Those NDCs is what makes this a bottom-up approach. A brief analogy is that basically how this works is that in my class, if I let students come in and tell me how many questions they had to get correct to earn an A. So a student could come in and say, look, there's 50 questions. If I get 10 right, then I get an A. And I'd be like, okay, that's fine. That's your own, that's your own pledge. You can do that and move forward in that way. How the Paris Agreement is different is that every pledge you make needs to be better than the prior one. So the next exam, they would come and say, well, now I'll get 15 right. And that's an A. I'm like, okay. And there'll be 20 and then grow. And the idea that eventually you'll be doing everything you need to do. But the criticism of this is you don't have to set a high bar for yourself if you don't want to, right? And that is what some people worry about. But let's talk about these NDCs a bit more. So as I said before, what this means is that governments set their own, quote, ambitious targets. That's the language that the agreement uses. And they must represent a progression over time. The issue with this is it's kind of vague. Like, what's ambitious? Growing up in a family of 6, ambitious means very different things to all of my siblings, right? That is a little vague. It needs to be more specific. And even a progression over time. How much of a progression, right? How much do I have to improve? How much more do I have to pledge? Some of that is a bit vague. But you make those goals, and then every 5 years you report. And we'll look at a map in a second because this has been in effect for 5 years, and we've had our first round of reporting. So we can see, okay, who reported? Did they set new kind of ambitious goals? What is this looking like today? Which is pretty interesting to look at. Now, as I said before, each target needs to exceed the prior one. It needs to be better, right? You always need to strive to improve yourself. And the goal here eventually is to reach this concept of net zero emissions, right? We have a thriving economy that's strong, that's providing livelihoods, but at the same time, we're not emitting anything from that, right? Everything is good, and then we can kind of really stop the progression of climate change that we see today. And just, kind of getting down to it a little bit more, As I said before, each country has its own power, right? And again, that is why we have so many countries participating. It's easy to opt into an agreement if you can kind of set your own bar and move up how you want. It's not binding. In the context of international law, all this means is that you set your own target, and there's really no enforcement mechanism to make sure that you hold that target. And if you don't, there's no right to punish you or cause any problems for you, right? So even if you set it, don't meet it, that's what happens. In the Kyoto Protocol, if you did not meet the target that was set for you, you would have to exceed that plus what you missed through the next cycle, right? So they punish you harshly in Kyoto for not kind of doing what you should be doing. This is not the case here. There's no mechanism to force compliance. This is a common critique / feature of international law, right? So if you pledge something, you don't do it. The question is, well, what happens to you, right? Is there any punishment? Can anyone do anything? And the short answer is not really, because there are international courts, things like that. But the unfortunate fact about international courts is if you choose not to comply and the court rules against you, it doesn't matter. Like, there's no police, there's no one to come get you, there's no one to punish you. You can just kind of do what you do, right? If you recall, the 2003 invasion of Iraq was an illegal war. I don't think anyone got obtained or punished for that action, right? That's not really how international law works, because state sovereignty is really given priority over everything else. So what we have instead is a system of naming and shaming. And the idea here is that, let's say the United States sets a target, they try, but they do nothing to try to actually achieve that target. And they just kind of shrug their shoulders and say, oops. The notion is that the rest of the world will point out the United States and say, that's not good enough. You're undermining the progress of the agreement. You're putting all of us at risk, and you should be ashamed of yourself. And the United States, in turn, after being named and shamed, will be like, okay, well, maybe this isn't good for our reputation. Maybe this isn't good for our international standing. Maybe we'll make a change. But again, it's not really, forcing compliance through any really strong means. It's basically just calling people out and saying they should be better. Which, if you're curious, there's a big body of scholarship in political science on this, and it tends to work, but mostly for weaker countries. For more powerful countries, it doesn't work as well, which you might expect. And if you have any questions about this, I'm sorry I'm speeding through. I'm really embarrassed that I'm going too long. I promise I would never become this person, but I am. Okay, so as I said before, what's fascinating about today, and this map was updated this month, is we've been through a cycle of reporting, right? So we can actually look at what people are actually up to. And so the green countries here are actually countries that have submitted stronger targets. So they're doing what they should be doing, right? They had a target, they tried to meet it, now they're going further. The reddish colors here, they didn't analyze. And then the blue countries, they didn't analyze because this organization has limited manpower and can't really get at everything that they would like to. But we do have a lot of cases where if you do submit a new target, it is going to be more ambitious, which is what's required. But a lot of countries have yet to update their targets. There's still time, but they should have submitted them by now, right? But it gets very complicated because, of course, you're not only trying to satisfy the requirements of the agreement, but your domestic audience needs to be happy too, right? And in some of these places, they're not happy about the agreement or they have reservations. The legislative bodies don't really want to take it up. And so it becomes a little bit different with process and bureaucracy and how that stuff plays out. But I put in this slide to try to make you happier that, hey, people are submitting more ambitious targets, which is what you want to see, right? So this should be a more kind of optimistic thing to see, at least I hope that it was. This one is less optimistic, and I apologize. And I'll talk you through it here. But another thing we can look at is basically for the Paris Climate Agreement at the 1.5 level, right? So better than 2. To hold, we need global emissions to decline by 2030 at this point. And so ideally, this green dotted line is where we need to be. And this blue shaded region, given the pledges and targets, this is where we are, right? So if we want to talk about a gap of where we are and where we need to be, given the pledges made by countries according to the Paris Climate Agreement, this is the gap, which you see illustrated on this right-hand side, right? And this gap is large, right? That's not a very positive thing to see, which means that many more targets need to be much more ambitious and quicker. But what is good to see is this bar on the left. This was September 2020, and the gap was larger, right, than in May 2021. So you've seen that even in a relatively short period of time, you've seen a fundamental shrinking in that gap. And if that trend continues, right, where countries continue to make new pledges, new targets, more ambitious, and it grows over time, then we can perhaps close this gap and get to where we need to be, right? So again, it doesn't look like we're doing good, but if you look at kind of this change that happened even over such a short period of time, you see something that looks a bit more positive and a bit more optimistic. All right. So I thought we could do our own quick naming and shaming, if you want to. We don't have to, but of course, this is not the whole world, but these are some countries that emit at some levels, and also the star right now, which is there's one country which is compatible with kind of the original agreement of 1.5, and that's the Gambia. So they are doing everything that they need to do on their part to make this the case. Then you have almost sufficient, right? So those countries that are really close to reaching this, we won't go through the names, but just to point out kind of where we are in terms of the number of countries, at least those that are highlighted in the report. The insufficient countries, right? So doing some stuff, not as much as they should. You see our United States of America, right, in that list. And for the record, during the Trump administration, the U.S. was over and critically because we withdrew and had no really pledges, and we pretended climate change didn't matter and it wasn't a thing we should be concerned about, and all those fun Trumpian things that we had happen. So, in just a short time of, the current administration, we kind of have this jump to insufficient, and it takes time in a democracy to move things forward. Right? I'm not saying it will move forward necessarily, and it will be quick, but there is an effort, I think, objectively to do something now, which as the second largest polluter in the world is essential. Right, that we are somebody that's involved, that are making these contributions and living up to the goals that we set for ourselves. Highly insufficient category, our Canadian friends not doing so well. But the big one here, of course, is China, which is the world's largest emitter. Right, if China and the United States do not really meet their goals, or they do not really participate fully, and the rest of the world does perfect, we're still in really bad shape. Right? Because they emit so much relative to these other countries that they are just essential. So in an ideal world, China and the United States need to shoot up here, right? To be either compatible or at least almost sufficient. Then the critically insufficient, those that are not really making much of an effort at all. And, no need to discuss right now why that might be the case, but there is kind of overarching politics that interacts with all of this as well. Okay, so given that, one of the, as I said before, if we end up at this net zero target, which is, the goal is by 2050, that puts us in really good shape. And what we have here are, so there's 73% of global emissions covered in this. For example, the United States emits 12%, China 25%, the EU 7%, other countries and other countries. And basically what this is showing is that these blue areas here are those cases where they actually do at least have proposals, or certain proposals are in discussion or in writing to reach these net zero targets, right? That is the case in the United States today, right? So there's a move to actually move towards the net zero target. It's a long way out, and Congress, of course, is very efficient and good. I'm sure they'll move quickly. That's a very dark joke. Probably the opposite, and not so good. But some things in the works. China has discussions. The EU is actually much further ahead, and then other countries. Some have already actually kind of reached some of those agreements. I believe the UK is one of those. Then 27% that don't really have any agreement, any initiative, anything in the works whatsoever. So ideally, these work out, right? Some of these countries come around, and by 2050, honestly, that puts us in pretty okay shape, because net zero emissions by 2050 is that is fundamental to really keeping it under the 2 degrees Celsius, right? Even if we continue to emit for a while, that's going to be a fundamental part of this process. And finally, show you all the maps here. This is probably, I think, the most intuitive and updated May 2021. The green, and you could say the yellow here, this is kind of the goal, right? Ideally, green better, less consequences. But once we get to this orange and red area, not great. So what we have is we have our current policies. And the current policies would put us somewhere between a 2.1 degrees Celsius increase and a 3.9, with kind of, in the middle 2.9. But it could be anywhere within this range, which is not good, right? We do not meet the goal. And it could be as high as 4, which is that kind of terrifying map that I showed you earlier on. The pledges and targets, right, where we are, based upon what countries have done in their NDCs, looks much better. And optimistically, if a lot of those net zero emissions laws and proposals are enacted and things move forward, we can actually perhaps accomplish what we hope to, but it could still be as high as 2.6, right? But that's better than 3.9. So long story short is, things are getting better. There are contributions. The question is whether or not these targets will be reached and how easy it will be for governments to actually move towards those net zero emissions targets. And finally, to wrap up, and again, I'm really sorry I went too long, but there's serious questions surrounding how effective it is. And a big reason, as I said before, is how it's designed, right? You set your own bar. It can be a low bar. What is meant by ambitious? All those things that I already spoke about. But what I really want to highlight is international treaties evolve all the time. So what usually happens is the initial treaty will be kind of a skeleton, and they'll add meat later on and strengthen it and change it and adapt it. So, the Paris Agreement will probably be the same way, right? It could change, it could become stronger, and it could actually become something that's quite significant. But no, it's not the only game in town necessarily, right? There's other things that are being done down to the individual level, and perhaps change can come from another venue. And finally, so I'm going quickly, but I didn't realize how long I've actually gone. But I think the obvious message is we can't really avoid the changes that are coming, right? They're going to be harsh and it's going to be difficult to cope. But the focus now is on minimizing those as much as possible and preparing for the consequences that will come from those. And so with that, I apologize, Richard. I'll never get invited for another talk probably, but there we go. That's what I got.
Nice. There's no need to apologize. We often have speakers go over a little bit. That's not a big deal. I do want to offer my condolences, though, on the Bills AFC Championship loss to the Chiefs. I know that was probably upsetting for you, although we all enjoyed it. Anyway, at this point, we are going to take up the collection. And while they're uploading that video, I want to tell you that next week, our speaker is going to be Michael Duffy, talking about the fight for Medicaid expansion in Missouri. We do request that you use the same Zoom link and log in about 5 minutes before 10. However, I'm sure most of you will log in at 10 minutes after. So with that said, let's watch this video. All right, thanks for attending today. The All Souls Forum is very important to our church. It provides us a chance to discuss the significant issues that impact our community. It's also important to me personally because I get to learn about the political issues that shape our world and ask questions of our speakers. From the attempted coup on the Capitol to recycling, we discuss all of the important issues. It costs about $100 a week to produce the forum. That's less than $5 a week per person watching on an average week. Andrea, can you show us how to support the UU Forum?
I'd be happy to, Richard. You can always send a check to the church. Be sure to put forum in the memo line. You'll find the address in chat, or you can find it on our website. To pay online, you can go to the All Souls website and click the big blue button, or click the link in chat. When you get to the giving page, enter the amount that you would like to give. On the next line, be sure to pick Give to Forum so that the money comes to support the forum. After that, you can choose how often you'd like to give. You can leave it at Give this one time, or you can pick Give this weekly, every 2 weeks, monthly, or yearly.
I like the idea of making a payment each month. It's just easier to budget.
I agree. That's what I usually do. After that, you can choose if you'd like to give with a debit card, credit card, or ACH bank transfer. The bank transfer will ask you to enter your numbers off of your check, and it will come directly out of your checking account. Once you've chosen that, pick Continue, enter the rest of your information. Feel free to add any comments you'd like. And if you'd like to cover the processing fee, you can click the button there and then click the Give bar.
Well, that seems easy enough. And let me take a moment to just say, hey, thanks to everyone making or planning on making a contribution. Now, Andrea, you keep mentioning that the links are in the chat. How do I see that?
If you're on a computer, it will open to the right of the video of the speaker without blocking anything. If you decide you're done, you can click the X at the top to close it, and that will not move you out of the meeting.
All right. So before we move on to the Q&A, can you please remind everyone how to virtually raise your hand?
Of course. Again, bring your mouse down to the bottom of your screen and look for the reactions button with the smiley face on it. Click it and then click anywhere on the raise hand bar. Zoom will put you in queue so that the moderator can call on you in the order your hand was raised. If you want to lower your hand, just repeat the steps and the bar will now have the lower hand option. If you'd like to see where you are in the queue, you can push the participants button and you will see this view showing you the order that you will be called on.
And for those of you on a phone, you can push *9.
Anything else I can show you guys today, Richard?
No, I think that covers it. It's time for questions. Yes, and before we get into the Q&A, I do want to offer my apologies. The speaker is not Michael Duffy, that's the moderator. The speaker is a gentleman, and I'm going to butcher his name most likely, named Nomachat Adiang. But the topic was correct. It's about the fight for Medicaid expansion in Missouri. Anyway, so a few things. This is a recorded and structured question and answer session. Please, no speeches. Try to word what you can as a question. If you have to make a brief preface, I'm not going to be bothered though. And for now, let's not ask follow-ups. In the unstructured thing, you can do all that stuff. I'm going to go ahead and jump in with the first question. I'm wondering, I noticed India was not on there. Is there a way to get India to set some kind of goals? I would imagine they have a fair amount of carbon emissions.
So it's interesting because international politics traditionally, how getting other countries to do things is, it's like us giving Pakistan a lot of foreign aid to help our fight in terror and things like that, right? So usually the incentives are, we'll help you in these other things that you have, that you deem to be part of your national interests or things that you think you need to accomplish. And in exchange, you move this way. But I think the climate change thing is a little bit different because India is one that is supposed to feel the impacts of climate change quite strongly. And I think that any sort of instability or any fundamental kind of change that leads to their economy, that to them incentivizes them doing something about it. And I think that the more countries feel it, the more they recognize that it makes them better off to deal with it now as opposed to wait for the more severe consequences later. And so this doesn't only apply to India, but I think it applies to a lot of other countries, and they're more apt to take action and do something. But that said, it's tough because a lot of it is sometimes the people need to demand that the government do something, and those governments need to be responsive to the preferences of the people, and that's not always the case in a lot of places, right? Because even in more authoritarian, less democratic places, if the people want a change and want a policy enacted, the leaders don't hear those preferences, or if they do, they don't care. And then the more democratic places, they tend to be these more complicated bureaucratic systems where it takes a lot to accomplish something, politics are what we usually call relatively mature, which means that different political parties and actors can draw out debates and prevent action and do things for their, for their own interests. So I don't know if that answers your question, Richard, about is that getting you to do something, but the long kind of point there is that there's a lot of things that you might do. Hopefully they'll recognize the benefits of doing it and do it. But again, it's kind of like, what do their people want? How's their system set up, and so forth. So, but I suspect that they will begin to think, because India is important, Brazil, who's growing, and of course, in that conversation as well, is important. And getting them to kind of be involved is vital.
All right, Juan, you're up.
All right, what I'd like to know is the UN doing anything about this issue?
Yeah, so.
And what are they doing?
Yeah, thanks, Lon. That's a very good question. So the United Nations, it may not surprise you, but it's a institution that is predicated upon protecting state sovereignty and state rights, right? So for the most part, the UN will facilitate discussions among and between countries, which is what it will do in these various, climate conferences and so forth. But for the most part, they will keep their hands out of forcing countries to do much of anything, because they are an institution that is built by countries to serve countries and protect the sovereignty of countries. So the United Nations serves a lot of really, really good purposes. So for example, I study UN peacekeeping, which is overwhelmingly effective and saves lives every single day. But there's a lot of things that they do or don't do that they should be doing that they choose not to do simply because they do prioritize kind of allowing countries to do what they want to do with themselves. So that concept of state sovereignty. So what are they doing? They facilitate discussion. They bring countries together. They try to kind of open these agreements, right? But they should probably be doing more. But as an institution, they're not really built to do that, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I got Mike Hoey, and then we're going to take a bio break.
So my question is about a CIA-funded program, Project Medea, that was led by Linda Zell in the early 90s, ran all throughout the 90s. It had used satellite imaging from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and the conclusion was that climate change was a massive issue. And so my question is, it seems like when the oil men came into power in the early 2000s and then the Twin Towers got hit, that all this stuff was kind of thrown out the window, and they said, well, the only way to maintain the American way of life and control over the countries that we control is to ignore all this stuff. Is that an accurate assessment, or am I just adding something that may not be accurate?
No, I think I'm sympathetic to your view, I'll say, because Lyndon B. Johnson was warned about climate change, but it was a long time ago, right? So it's not something that we be like, oh, well, we didn't know what was happening, right? So we're in the dark, we had no idea. And so there has been recognition that it's been a problem. And the frustrating thing is that there's been a lot of my colleagues who have interviewed Congress people behind closed doors and bureaucrats and people that kind of go on the record and say that, like, oh, this climate chasing is overrated, it's alarmist, it's not a problem. But behind closed doors, those people tell my colleagues in their research that it is a big deal. I know it's a big deal, but to raise funds and for politics, I can't really say that to my base, right? That'll get me in trouble. And that's frustrating. And I think as far as kind of, ignoring it for U.S. national security and that sort of thing, there has been a lot of money put into leading to a lot of doubt. One of my memories about kind of the move towards climate change, where I thought everything might get better, is Al Gore came and talked at Boise State when I was an undergrad, and it was as a packed house, and it was so packed that people had to wait outside the stadium, and they put speakers so they could hear him, right? And that's crazy in the state of Idaho because it's really conservative. And those people at that point, I think public opinion was like 70% of Americans recognize that climate change is an issue and a problem and it needs to be dealt with, right? It's one of the primary issues of our time. But within the next 4 years, because of interest in money and how politics works, all of a sudden that public opinion just dropped again, and it became like 30 to 40%, and it became a serious issue again. So those interests have a whole lot of power. And I saw in chat that somebody pointed out that, there's relatively few companies that do most of the emissions, and that's true, right? When they come in and say, oh, well, you should recycle more, that's them just passing the buck, right? It's really up to those corporations to deal with the problem, but they don't want to, and it's in their interest to do exactly what you described. So I'm very sympathetic to your view.
All right, with that, we are going to stop the recording here and take a brief bio break for those that need it. That will certainly be me. And then we'll go into about 20 minutes of unstructured question and answer, provided that Bryce is available the whole time. Next week, I do want to remind you again that the speaker is Nomachat Adiang, and it's probably not pronounced like that, who will be speaking on the topic of the fight for Medicaid expansion in Missouri. You can join us via the same Zoom link. Log in about 5 minutes before 10 a.m., please. However, I'm sure that request won't matter, and you'll log in 10 minutes after.